So hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining us for our first event of 2021. My name's Jordan. I'm one of the leads for Streets for People. If you don't know us already, we're a relatively new organization dedicated to advocating for safer streets, fast and frequent transit, and dense, vibrant neighborhoods across the San Francisco Bay Area. You can follow us on Twitter at S4P Bay Area. And if you'd like to support our work, I'd encourage you to join YIMBY Action, our parent organization, at yimbyAction.org/join. I'd also like to thank Seamless Bay Area, the Trans Bay Coalition, Friends of Caltrain, and the San Francisco Transit Riders for co-sponsoring today and helping us get the word out about this event. So on to the event. Today we're joined by Scott Goldstein, Policy Director at Transportation for America. He'll be sharing his insights into what a Biden administration and a Democratic majority in Congress is likely to mean for local transit and for safe streets nationwide. A couple logistical notes before we get started. First, the event will be recorded and we'll be sharing it out afterwards. And during the presentation, please add questions to the chat or to the Q&A feature, and we'll be collecting those and asking them afterwards during the Q&A section. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Scott.
Thank you, and hi everybody. I'm on the East Coast, or it's 9 o'clock, but I think everybody here is on the West Coast, so it's very good to be with you. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and I'm gonna walk through a couple of slides, and certainly happy to take questions if anything pressing comes up during the presentation, but I'll make sure there's plenty of time after for Q&A as well. So just briefly about Transportation for America. We're a nonprofit alliance of elected business and civic leaders from communities across the country. Our mission is to support moving people safely and affordably to jobs and services by multiple means of travel with minimal impact to communities and the environment. And we do this through advocacy, technical assistance, research, and analysis. I'm the policy director at Transportation for America, so I'm focused on the advocacy. But we do work with local communities all across the country. We do work with cities and towns all throughout California and in all 50 states, quite honestly. And it's that technical assistance and on-the-ground practical work combined with our research and analysis that informs all of our advocacy. Just a brief agenda. I'm going to go over the election outcome. Certainly no surprise there. And then what we see is that both the crisis and the opportunity facing public transit. Talk about some major upcoming transportation legislation here in DC and what we think might be some of the impacts of the president-elect. And then some actions that you all can take. And what's not listed there is, as I said earlier, plenty of time for Q&A. So first, election results. We have a new president. Not everybody I know understands that that's happening, but we will have a new president. The president-elect has put out the Build Back Better plan. And we just want to highlight that that plan has some really good language on transit. If you all haven't seen it, I encourage you to take a look at it. You can see a screenshot of it there, but we're very heartened by that language. We're also pretty heartened by the Department of Transportation transition team that was announced a couple of weeks ago. My organization has sees a lot of friendly faces on that team, but others around the country I know see friendly faces on that team, and we're very heartened about what that might mean for the personnel selections and then the policies that might come from the next administration. We, in particular, are pleased to see the Build Back Better plan because we rated the President-elect's infrastructure plan, the last iteration when it was the Biden-Sanders Unity Plan, poorly. So I'm noting that because in our estimation, it's improved and it's gotten better over time, and so we're very excited to see that and hope for more to come in the coming weeks and months. In the House, the election, I'm sure everybody knows, resulted in Democrats keeping the majority, but the majority got much smaller. That said, some of my organization's key members of Congress were reelected, and certainly members that are essential to achieving the transportation vision that we're going to talk about. So you can see them all there. I won't go through them all, but key Republicans and Democrats got reelected. But that's not to say there aren't important members throughout California and elsewhere. These are just some key ones that we're highlighting. In the Senate, we now know the outcome. Democrats are going to have a razor-thin majority with the vice president breaking a 50-50 split now that the two Georgia runoff elections have been decided. We'll talk more about this, but you can see a chart right there of how we ranked the infrastructure bills approved by the House and Senate in the last Congress. And we were very supportive of the House bill and found that the Senate bill did not achieve any of the goals that we wanted to see. And so the point I want to make with that is that even though the Democrats have a majority, and a lot of folks, and I've seen this in the press and I've seen it from many of our fellow advocates, are very excited about what that might mean. In our view, we have a bipartisan problem, particularly in the Senate, in the sense that the Senate Democrats unanimously voted for that Senate bill that we opposed. Senate Republicans unanimously voted for it. And with the Senate flipping, we're hopeful that there'll be a new direction, but we have to work really hard to make sure that what caused that bipartisan vote last year doesn't continue into this Congress. So we'll talk more about what we thought were the issues with that bill in just a second. So the crisis and the opportunity facing public transit. I'm sure everybody on this call knows that when the COVID-19 crisis hit, public transit revenue and ridership plummeted, sales taxes that supported transit plummeted, and at the same time, agencies had to step up their cleaning and other procedures to deal with the crisis. So that was increased spending, even while their revenue was plummeting. And so we had the CARES Act that was passed in March. An unprecedented $25 billion was provided for transit and emergency relief. Most of us knew at the time, and transit agencies were saying at the time, that this money was both not enough and it was not allocated according to the need. They used existing formulas. And so you can see a chart up there. There was a pretty good understanding quickly that the money was not going to last very long. But we were grateful for that funding. It was unprecedented, it was essential, and it was wonderful to see that happen. So that was March. We spent the whole year, many of the folks in this call I know were part of this process as well. We spent the whole year fighting for more funding for public transit to save the industry. And so just a couple of weeks ago, a second stimulus bill was approved. It had $14 billion for public transit. You can see how it's distributed in the document there on the screen on the left-hand side. But there was a cap. Funding was distributed to urbanized areas, capped at 75% of the region, the overall region's 2018 operating costs. This benefited a lot of agencies. A lot of the bigger agencies that didn't do as well under the CARES Act in March ended up doing a lot better under this bill. But we still know that many regions did not receive enough money. Many regions are looking out. They can survive for 6, 8, 10 months with this funding, and then at the end they have a cliff because their local sales tax hasn't recovered and other revenue sources haven't recovered. So we know that more stimulus and emergency relief is going to be necessary for public transit. But it's also, I think, an opportunity. This hashtag transit is essential is now widely used. Members of Congress across the aisle voted twice for that emergency funding that I just mentioned, in March for the CARES Act and in December for the additional relief. Members know that transit is essential for economic recovery. That case has been made clearly. Members of Congress know that transit is essential for racial and social equity. That case, I think, has been made clearly. Members know that transit is essential for dealing with climate change. And again, I think that case has been made clearly. But we need to keep the focus on transit being essential for all these reasons. And you all locally can talk about the specific reasons locally, but national, we're making the case on these 3 points for why transit is essential. I think that's a huge opportunity. We now have members of Congress and senators who've cast these votes, who've seen this messaging, who've heard from local advocates over and over again over the course of this month. And so that's moved the needle in a major way, and we can build on the stimulus funding that we've received. And so what I mean is, you can see the money that has been received is for transit operations, and that's frankly unprecedented in recent years. The federal government provides very little transit operating funding, mostly to very small agencies. The major agencies and the major Cities in this country do not receive any operating support. So we think we can build on the unprecedented support for transit operations and try to secure operating support in the next infrastructure bill, and to frankly try to secure additional funding for transit overall, because we've made the case that transit is essential. So we need to build on this momentum. And so, sorry for the back and forth on the slide. So I just want to highlight a report that we did. We did it in partnership with Transit Center and Data for Progress. It's called A Green New Deal for City and Suburban Transportation. You can see the link there, and I'm certainly happy to send it around. As part of that report, we did some polling. You can see, just some highlights right here, but one of the things we found that was among people who reported a car was their primary mode of transportation, 80% of those felt that they had no choice to drive as much as they do. And 77% of voters believe that the US would benefit from expanding public transit. We found a lot more great stuff on transit and our transportation system in the poll. Those are just two things to highlight. But that really gives us the sense that the public is on the side of investing in transit, and frankly in transit safe and supportive communities. What you see here is an overview of some of the things that are in the Green New Deal for city and suburban transportation, and some additional things that we've proposed since that report came out. But top line, we think that we now have an opportunity to get major new investment in transit, including for operations. We think we can and we must reform the highway program to support transit so that we build transit-friendly streets and safer communities. And so we need to prioritize safety over speed. We need to promote a fix-it-first approach to highways. We need to have a program for highway teardowns and community restoration. We need to fund highways and transit equally. This is something that we've been really leading the effort on, and we'll talk more about it later on in the presentation. And we need to promote transit-oriented development. These are just a few things. This is top line. There's a lot more detail in the report, and I'll be glad to talk about any of these things in more detail or anything else that might be on your mind. But we think that we really have a unique and unprecedented opportunity to move the needle on these issues in this Congress. So what's coming next? There's a couple of different avenues to achieve these legislative priorities. Even though a number of stimulus bills have been approved, we know that there's a potential for additional stimulus, which would have additional, perhaps, emergency relief for transit, as well as other investments in infrastructure. There's the surface transportation reauthorization, which I'm going to spend more of my time talking about tonight. That's the process of setting policy for 5 years at a time, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. There's FY22 appropriations. That's the spending that Congress does every year. Whether or not a new reauthorization is passed and new policy is set, they still have to spend money for fiscal year 22 on priorities, and we think transit should be among those priorities. So that's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to focus on reauthorization, however. Ultimately, though, a lot of work remains to pass a stimulus and an infrastructure bill that my organization can support. We want to make sure a stimulus is well designed. We don't just want an infusion of funding into the status quo. And frankly, that's what we saw in 2009 with the Recovery Act. And we want to learn from what we did there and do better. And we need to fundamentally change transportation. So we need to rewrite the program itself and not pump more money into the broken system. And that's where we get to the reauthorization that I mentioned. So turning to reauthorization now, the FAST Act is the name for the current law. Forgive me if folks are already up to speed on all this, but I just want to level set a bit. Congress extended the deadline for this bill, so it now expires in September of 2021. So that's a long ways away, it may seem, but we have to engage now. If past this prologue, there's going to be a number of different extensions for a few months or a couple, maybe a year or so, but we need to start working now to get policy before lawmakers, so when they finally get around to passing a bill, that they do what we're hoping they'll do. In the House, I'll talk more about this, but they passed a transformative bill in the last Congress that we truly supported that makes investments in transit and safer streets a priority. So we need to build on that. And in the Senate, as I mentioned, we did not support their bill. So we need to push uphill to get the reform that we think is necessary. So yeah, this is just a succinctly put, we would argue that we don't have a funding problem, we have a policy problem. And the point of showing this slide is that if you talk to a lot of lawmakers on Capitol Hill and you ask them about transportation, the thing they will say is we need to raise more money. The gas tax doesn't bring in enough revenue, we have to find more money. And we probably do need more money if we really want to make the investments we need to make. But we have to know where we're investing and what we're going to invest in, we think, before we identify how we're going to pay for it. And when we spend our time talking about the need to raise money without explaining what we're going to raise the money to invest in, we don't build the political support for that revenue, and we end up stuck without either the policy or the funding. So we want to get the policy right, and then we want to talk about funding. And so we want to point out that we have a policy problem. So from my organization's perspective, we have a couple of priorities. We want to prioritize maintenance, particularly in the roadway program, although there's an enormous transit maintenance backlog as well. But on roadways, we are spending money on new capacity at an enormous rate while our existing roadway network is falling apart. And you can see there, 37 states, despite an enormous investment in the Recovery Act in 2009, have seen their roadways go into disrepair over that time period. So we need to prioritize maintenance, and we think that's important and relevant to transit because all of this roadway expansion is creating communities that are not safe and conducive to transit, to being a pedestrian, to being a cyclist, and to accessing transit. And so we need to start fixing our existing system first, stop expanding it until we can maintain our system. And in the next couple slides, I'll talk about how we improve it so that it is safe and convenient for people who want to use transit. Designing for safety over speed is critical. We need to prioritize the safety of our communities and not the speed of vehicles traveling through our communities. And so that is our second, but I don't mean second in importance, principle. And we've been making the case on Capitol Hill, and I think you all are familiar with these issues, but the faster a vehicle is going, the more dangerous it is to be a pedestrian. And so many of our streets on which buses are operating, streets on which people are waiting for the bus or trying to cross to get to the other side where there might be housing or shopping or a rail station perhaps, are high-speed roadways without accommodations for pedestrians. And so at the high speeds we see, we're seeing enormous levels of fatalities. And you can see that in this chart here. It is getting safer and safer to be a passenger in a vehicle, which is fantastic. Certainly we want people to be safe in their vehicles, but it is getting more and more dangerous to be a person outside of a vehicle. And that's because, we would argue, because our communities are dangerous by design. Certainly it has to do with the design of the vehicle as well, and that's something that we want to talk about, but our communities are simply dangerous by design. They're putting the vehicle first and not the pedestrian. And so we need to prioritize safety if we want to address this trend and also make transit as viable as we think it needs to be. Our third priority is to organize our system around connecting people to jobs and services. Currently, as I mentioned, we're looking at speed, and we need to, as I said, put safety over speed, but we need to put access to jobs and services over speed as well. If you're driving a long distance at high speed, you don't have great access to whatever you're trying to get to. But if you look at the federal transportation program, that's an A+ because you're driving at high speed and you don't have any delay. But if you live close to what you might need, your job, your school, your doctor's office, what have you, and maybe you stop at a red light or a pedestrian is crossing the street, or there's a bus that you have to stop for, whatever it may be, because you've had a couple of instances of delay, that could be a failure. And our transportation system program now is trying to eliminate that failure, widen that road, expand that roadway network to make sure there's no delay. This undermines biking and walking. This undermines transit. So we need to focus on whether people have access to the things they need, not how fast they're going on the roadway. And we think that if we do that, we'll start to prioritize transit investments, we'll start to prioritize biking and walking investments, and shorter car trips as well. And it's important, I think, to mention that these things are all interrelated. More and more highways, prioritizing more and more roadways leads to more driving. It induces more demand. It leads to more emissions through all that driving. And it leads to more congestion. And it leads to not enough transit. We're putting all of our money, literally 80% of it, and we'll talk about that in a minute, into the highway program, and we're not investing in transit. And we're not getting what we want with all that money. We're just getting more emissions, more congestion. And so on that point, miles driven per person has grown by 20% in the 100 largest urban areas since 1993, despite enormous, as you saw in a previous slide, enormous investments in highway expansion around the country. People are driving more and more and more. It's leading to sprawl, causing people to drive all those great distances. And adding all that capacity is not producing results. This is from a report that we did called the Congestion Con. We looked at those 100 largest urbanized areas, and we found that overall freeway capacity grew faster than population. You can see 42% freeway growth, 32% population growth, but 144% growth in congestion. In the report, you'll see each urbanized area broken down. Some urbanized areas saw population loss and congestion increases. Some urbanized areas saw roadways and population increase at the same level. And everywhere we looked, we saw congestion increases. So we're not getting the outcome that we're told we're going to get. One more lane is not solving the congestion problem. And one more lane is helping to contribute to the climate crisis. Transportation, as everybody knows, is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions now in terms of the sectors of our economy. We're emitting more because we're driving more. And you can see on the chart there the relationship between CO2 emissions and driving. And so all this investment in highways, all this underinvestment in transit is leading to outcomes that none of us want: more congestion and more pollution. And it's also failing to address equity and, frankly, worsening equity. If you don't have access to a car in too many places, you're locked out of the economy. And those safety implications that I mentioned earlier are much more profound in communities of color and low-income communities because the system there just does not, in those communities, does not prioritize the safety of those people. And so we need to deal with this system if we want to address racial and economic equity as well. And these are just photos that show some stark examples of how the transportation system can exacerbate some of those inequities. I love this slide because I think it illustrates really well what we'll get if we don't reform our program. We'll get a few electric cars on a system that is still inherently auto-centric, inequitable, and does not provide adequate transit for people who need it. And this slide as well. If we do not reform our system, we'll just electrify all the cars stuck in congestion on the highway, and it'll be cleaner congestion. And while cleaner congestion is better, I suppose, than today's congestion, it's not a solution that any one of us would, I think, relish, because being stuck in congestion is a bipartisan scourge. And so we need reform. So that's the top line on stimulus, and that's the way we've been making the case to federal policymakers, on reauthorization. I do want to briefly turn to stimulus. As I mentioned, we've got two bills that provided a total of $39 billion for public transit. We know that additional money is going to be necessary, and we're working with groups like the Public Transit Association, a Transit Center, and others to identify what that level of funding is and what the timeline of that ask will be. So, for example, do we need funding to sustain transit for the next fiscal year or for the next 3, 4, 5 years to deal with all of the fallout of COVID-19? We're working on that now. Certainly welcome your input on that. But the next steps on stimulus are unclear. The president-elect is planning to release his proposal for stimulus on Thursday. And so we'll have to see what's in that. Obviously, the Congress is going to be dealing with impeachment and approving the president's cabinet and so many other things. And so How quickly they will move on a stimulus is unclear, but we want to make sure that transit is part of that next stimulus if there is one. And so we need to make the case for transit. And I know that we've done that. We talked about transit being essential, and we talked about all the ways in which it's essential. But we have to keep doing that. And so I'm just highlighting here a report that we did that includes recommendations for emergency stabilization and recovery. I don't know how the president-elect will talk about this next proposal, but we might be in the recovery phase now. And so we might need to be talking about, instead of emergency support to save the industry, what do we need for recovery to make sure the industry can grow and thrive? And so there's some ideas in that report. Another key point I think this group would appreciate knowing is that we looked at what happened in 2009 with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. That's the ARA that you see mentioned on the slide there. We saw that an ARA dollar spent on public transportation produced 70% more job hours than the same dollar spent on highways. So we want lawmakers to understand that when you invest in transit as a stimulative measure, you're creating jobs because by and large, you're investing in the operations of that system, the operator who is running that bus or that train. When you invest in highways, you're buying right-of-way, you're buying materials, and those things are important, but it's not the direct infusion into jobs that transit is. And so we talk more about our research into the economic impacts of the infrastructure part of the Recovery Act in this report here. You all may find that interesting. So in sum, on the legislative front, with reauthorization and stimulus being the two key things that I just talked about, from our perspective, the work continues and our ultimate strategy doesn't change. House and Senate members need to be educated into the effects of the current system, worsening congestion, worsening climate change, worsening equity. And they need to understand that we need to invest in transit and safer communities to deal with the congestion, the climate effects, and the equity implications of our current system. So in the House, we want to build on the INVEST Act that I talked about earlier. We want targeted and effective stimulus. I didn't talk much about this, but when they do get around to regular appropriations later this year, we want to make sure that they provide robust funding for the transit programs. And so that's what we're looking at legislatively. And certainly happy to talk more about that if there's any questions. On the executive branch, and I'm getting towards the end of this presentation here, on the executive branch, we certainly expect that there will be new priorities and new opportunities on transit and also on the broader community in which transit operates. Many of you may have heard about the BUILD program, used to be the TIGER program. That was turned primarily into a road program during the Trump administration. We have every reason to think that that program would be oriented back towards transit and multimodal projects. Passenger rail, I mean, people call the president-elect Amtrak Joe. We have every reason to think that he will be supportive of passenger rail. One thing that we have been working on is how do we incentivize corridors where we have frequent intercity service, and we build that on top of the existing long distance network, and so that we can have a real viable, robust passenger rail network in this country. Public transit, certainly, we think that this will be a priority for the new administration. I showed you at the beginning where they talk about it in the Build Back Better plan. And climate change and equity. They've made clear that no matter what agency they're looking at, whether it's the transportation department or the energy department or you name it, that climate change and equity are going to be central to the mission of the agency. And we think that without the reforms that we've talked about, you can't address climate change and equity in the transportation program. So we think that those priorities will move us in the right direction. There's a number of opportunities for executive action. That's one of the things that the administration could do on day one. We've sent a memo to the administration with some ideas. I'm just highlighting a few here. But for example, we could have a greenhouse gas performance measure where states could be required to reduce greenhouse gases in the transportation program. And that would mean ultimately that they have to take their highway dollars and invest it into projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, for example, public transit. We think that there should be an equity criteria for investment. The federal government can provide states with a tool for measuring the equity impacts of an investment. and that can be a criteria that you're judged on when you receive discretionary grants. We need to improve safety by eliminating the ability for states to set negative safety targets. And what I mean there is that under current law, a state can say that they expect more people to die next year on their roads than this year. And that's perfectly legal. We think that's outrageous, however, and so we think the ability to set that negative target should be eliminated. There's a number of actions that the current administration took that were harmful to transit, and we think that all of those could be repealed immediately. And so that would make it easier to get funding out the door to build and expand public transit. Those are just some examples. There's more, and I'm happy to talk about any of this in more detail. And last but not least, there's the bully pulpit. This administration can talk about transit, can visit transit projects, can highlight the transit workforce and transit riders. And in so doing, that can move Congress and move the public in the direction that we want to see. And so we think that's an enormous opportunity. Two big issues that I just want to highlight that my organization is going to be pushing this year, in addition to all the other stuff I just mentioned. We think it's incredibly important for Congress to look at the historic 80-20 split in transportation funding. And what I mean by that is 80% of federal dollars for transportation are allocated to roadways and 20% for transit. And it's been that way since 1982. And in our estimation, the logic for doing that is no longer applicable. This was a deal that President Reagan struck in the early 80s to give 20% of a gas tax increase to transit. And the idea being that, you know, we'll get the votes of urban members of Congress for this because we're giving money to transit, but we're not going to give too much to transit because we don't want to take from the driver who's paying the tax and from the roadway network that we should be supporting with that gas tax. But we all know that the gas tax doesn't bring in enough money, that we're taking general fund dollars and we're subsidizing the Highway Trust Fund with general tax dollars because the Highway Trust Fund, or the gas tax doesn't bring in enough money. And so that's what I mean when I say the logic for this 80-20 split no longer applies. If general tax dollars are going to the transportation program, there's no reason that 80% of those should go to the highway program. We need to revisit that. If it's a stimulus, there's no reason that 80% of the transportation part of a stimulus should go to highways. That's all deficit spending. But in 2009, that's what happened. Roughly 80% went to highways and 20% went to transit. And so we want to have Congress think about this. They've never done that since 1982. Congressman Chuy Garcia from Illinois, he introduced a resolution in the last Congress calling for Congress to fund highways and transit equally. He is going to reintroduce that in this Congress. I don't know what day yet. I'll certainly let the group know once I know when that's coming, but this is critically important. It's moving the Overton window, so to speak. It's expanding the definition of what's possible. And we want to get members of Congress on record supporting funding highways and transit equally. So we'll keep you updated as that progresses. The other issue that I just wanted to call your attention to that we're going to be pushing is we think we need a program to undo the damage of so-called urban renewal. We have a proposal in partnership with Third Way. It's a group you all may have heard of. And you can see the outlines of that proposal there. We think we need a major investment to tear down highways that are cutting apart communities, that are creating infrastructure barriers. We need to establish land trusts so that once that highway has been torn down, and we reconnect the community and build generational wealth within that community. And so that we have the land trust there to make sure that that happens. We need to update our models. I know this sounds technical and boring, but we need to update our models so that we recognize that doing these types of projects will not lead to so-called Carmageddon, but will actually benefit our communities. So that gets to what I mentioned earlier, where a high-speed, long-distance trip is a success and a slower speed, shorter distance trip is a failure. And then we need to identify communities that are particularly harmed by these infrastructure barriers so we can prioritize where we make these investments. So that's a proposal that we have out there that we're looking to get a member of Congress to introduce. And we'll keep you updated as that moves along as well. And this is the last bit of my presentation. I probably don't have to tell any advocates on this call what I'm about to say, but just want to make sure it's just reiterated that advocacy works. There's just an overview of some of the numerous pieces of advocacy that happened this year that secured all this transit funding. Labor unions weighed in, hundreds of organizations around the country, perhaps many of the folks in this call and the organizations they're a part of signed on. In my time as an advocate, as a former congressional staffer, I've never seen so many local transportation advocacy groups get engaged at the federal level. It was game changing, and we need to remind you all because it's so appreciated that this advocacy worked, and we need to keep going because that's how we're going to get change. So, we need to keep taking action. You all are doing great work. Folks around the country are doing great work, but we need to keep engaging our officials, tracking what's happening, talking to reporters and getting the stories out there. On transit in particular, keep up the pressure. If you're emailing your member of Congress and you think I've already sent him or her a couple of notes and they've done what I needed and I'll give them a break, well, don't. Please keep telling them that transit is essential. And make sure that they see that local community advocates want investments in transit. And last, I think this is the last slide, and it's just a little bit redundant to what I said earlier, but whether it's going to be stimulus or whether it's a new authorization or regular appropriations, we know these things are coming. We don't know when, we don't know how fast, but they're going to come, and it's going to be, I think, a little bit of nothing's happening, and then all of a sudden Congress is going to move to pass a bill in just a few days. So we have to be prepared now. We have to be engaging lawmakers now. And so, as I said earlier, that advocacy works, and we need to make sure we're doing it. So that's it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I look forward to taking your questions.
All right, that was fantastic. Thank you, Scott.
Sure.
So we're going to transition into Q&A now. While we're doing that, feel free to continue sending questions either to the chat or to the Q&A box. And one other thing we wanted to say is if you're here and you have affiliations with organizations that are interested in pursuing further transit advocacy at the federal level, go ahead and drop those into the chat, and we'll be collecting those up afterwards and reaching out if we have the opportunity. And with that, let's dive into our first question. This is from Kat Carter. She wanted to hear a little bit more about the funding highways and transit equally and the 80-20 rule, which you talked about a little bit, and in particular, what changing it to 50-50 might mean on the ground. For example, is that how we might get to a second Transbay tube in the Bay Area? And what if we flip that to 2080 instead of 80-20?
Yeah, great question. What it might mean on the ground is a little bit difficult to predict because it all depends on how that money is spent. Right now, the money that is spent on public transit is primarily for maintenance and for capital projects. If we just made it 50-50, then, and we just kept it focused on maintenance and capital projects, that would be an enormous amount of expansion of the public transit system. It could be a new Transbay tube in this region. It could be, making a significant dent in the maintenance backlog all around the country. It's tough to say. But imagine with all this new money for transit, if we dedicated a significant portion of that to operations. We could run more frequent and more reliable service. We could perhaps start running, express routes where we didn't have them before, for example. There's a whole host of things that communities could do if we had these resources to do it. We could electrify much faster our bus systems, perhaps. So I'm just throwing out some examples. Your question is spot on. We're actually working with folks to start to sort of vision what that could mean. What are some different options for spending all the new money that would come from equal investment in highways and transit? Because right now it is sort of open-ended and maybe a little bit esoteric, and we want to give people concrete examples of what that could mean. And then last, I would say every community is different. If this were to happen, no matter how it's invested, ultimately it would be up to the transit agency to decide how they want to invest that money. And so the question of the Transbay Tube ultimately comes down to the planning agencies and the agency in your community. But I think if there were a 50-50 split, there'd be the financial constraints on doing that would be a lot less, shall we say. And what if we flipped it to 80-20 transit? I'm sold. I think it's hard enough to get to 50-50. So that's where we're starting. But, one of these days, maybe we can get to totally flipping it to 80-20.
We all hope so. Next question from Seamless. Is there an initiative to enable more federal money to go for operations versus capital projects?
That's something that I know we're going to be pushing. And I know a lot of the advocates that we're working with want to push. And that's why I made the point of highlighting that all this emergency operating support for transit that we've gotten this past year, it's all for operations. And we want to make sure Congress remembers that they did this. It's not, if we had come to them in March of last year before the crisis and said, we need to spend $40 billion on transit operations this year, we would have been laughed out of the room because that's not what they do. But now that they've done that, we think we can go in and say, look at what it's done in your community. Look at how essential this service is and how people demanded it and you stepped up to provide it. So let's build on that and get operation support. So that's certainly a case that we're going to make.
Great. On the executive side of things, do you have thoughts specifically on Biden's choice of Pete Buttigieg for Secretary of Transportation and what might come of that?
Yeah, we ranked all the candidates' plans back when the field was full early in the primary season, including the president's plan. And the secretary designate's plan was the only one that we supported. He wanted to invest in complete streets. He wanted to invest in a whole host of things that we thought were the right investments. So of all the plans, we gave his the highest marks. So we're excited. And we're going to be, holding him accountable to doing the things he says he wants to do. But we're looking forward to working with him.
Sounds good. On the gas tax, Steve asked, the gas tax has been sold as the way to build roads for gas guzzlers. How can we convince drivers that they should be supporting transit? And can we get Republicans in the Senate to buy into the idea that transit is important?
Yeah. And on the last part of that question on Republicans, we've been doing a lot of work with rural transit agencies. North Carolina, Oklahoma, Montana. Those are obviously just 3 states, but virtually every state has significant rural transit. And a lot of folks, including the representatives, aren't aware of that transit. And that may be because, and often is because, the rural transit provider is sometimes a skeleton crew of 1 or 2 or 3 staff, and they're operating the bus. They're the mechanic when the bus breaks down. They're the general manager paying the bills, and they don't have time to go talk to their congressperson or their senator or anything else. They don't have a government affairs staff. They don't have a lobbyist. And so their presence is not well known for a lot of members of Congress. And so we're working with them to try to tell their story. And I think, we've seen some of that story break through in this crisis of COVID, because rural transit has been hit incredibly hard, and lawmakers have taken note of what that's meant to their community. So I think that's one aspect where we can try to get Republican support, because often, obviously, Republicans represent those areas. In terms of the question about, I think the question was about the gas tax, and it's sold as a, would you mind repeating that first part? I don't remember, actually.
Oh, yeah. The gas tax has been sold as a way to basically to fund roads for cars.
Yeah.
And how can we convince drivers that they should support transit as well?
Oh, right. Well, I mean, the evidence is clear that, when you invest in transit, that you are also improving the overall efficiency of the system, which benefits drivers. In addition, when you invest in a community, broadly speaking, that is safe and convenient for transit, it's also better for drivers. Most drivers, myself included, and I'm sure everybody on this call who drives, do not want to drive a long distance, do not want to sit in traffic. We'd be just as happy with a short trip to the grocery store, and probably much happier than a long trip. And so communities that are better connected, that have destinations closer together, that are more walkable, that are more transit friendly, also mean that if you're going to be driving, that your trip is likely to be a shorter trip. And so that too is better for drivers. And then last, those communities, because they enable people to bike and walk and take transit, mean that if you are driving, your roadway network is going to be less congested. So it's a better experience as well. So we're trying to make that case. That's why I talked about the congestion con and all this roadway expansion only worsening congestion, because we have to, we think, break that belief amongst the public and policymakers that one more lane will just solve the problem if we just have one more lane. And we think the facts are on our side with that one.
And a question from John. Speaking of the flip side of that, there's been some thinking, some rumors about the idea of $10 billion for urban highway removal.
Yeah.
Do you think that's likely, and what might that look like in practice?
Yeah, that's we think that's what we're talking about with that proposal at the end that I mentioned that we've done in partnership with Third Way. The $10 billion proposal was included in a bill that the Senate Democrats released at the end of last year. We worked with the staff who drafted that proposal, so we're very supportive of that. We think that that's headed in the right direction. I mentioned we didn't like the Senate broad infrastructure bill, but one of the things in there that was good was they had a small program to tear down highways and plan for reconnecting neighborhoods. And then they came out with this $10 billion proposal that was even better. And so we're very hopeful that in this Congress they'll go even further, and we're going to be pushing for that.
Great. Question from Sabik. To what degree should cutting costs and figuring out why they're ballooning so much be a major priority for federal legislation?
That's certainly a talking point that we hear, that we shouldn't invest in transit because it's so costly. I've seen research showing that our projects in America are more costly than similar projects around the country, around the world. But I've seen research disagreeing with that. And I think that, we need to address that issue for sure. But that's not where our focus is. Our focus is going to be on some of the other factors that make a transit project seem so expensive. And what I mean is 80% of the money is for highways. I mentioned that already. But within that 80%, states can subsidize the cost of a new highway project 80%. And they only have to pay 20% locally to build that new highway project, that new lane, that new road. In some cases, they only have to pay 10%. In some cases, the federal subsidy is 90%. So the overwhelming majority of money goes to roads, and then roads are subsidized at a very high level. For transit, and that money is automatic because it comes from the gas tax, and it's automatically provided to states every year through a formula. The money for public transit is a much lower subsidy. First of all, only 20% of the formula goes to public transit, and then they cannot reimburse themselves 80% the same way they can with highways. But then there's a separate program for building new transit. It's even smaller. It's only $2.5 billion every year. And the federal government will only pay for half the cost of a transit project through that program. And so if you want to build a new Transbay tube, you have to compete against every other project in the country for some part of that 2.5 billion. And then whatever amount you get, the government will only subsidize the cost of the project 50%. So the locals have to come up with the other half. So it makes a transit project look so much more expensive because the feds will only pay for half of it. And so we need to deal with that. We need to provide equal funding overall. And then we need to make sure that once that funding is allocated to the states, that they can subsidize the project itself at the same level. And if they're going to do 80% for roads, then it should be 80% for transit as well.
Great. Speaking sort of a general question, when federal dollars are allocated, how are they allocated down to specific agencies? So for example, in the Bay Area, we have a plethora of different transit agencies. And how does federal funding get allocated to each of those?
Yeah, it's very complicated. There are some really capable staff at the Department of Transportation who crunch the numbers and figure out the allocations. I can't speak for the Bay Area itself because every region is going to be different. But in general, and I'm just talking about transit now, but in general, the money is allocated both to agencies, according to a formula that Congress has already set. And that has to do with ridership level, the square mile that the agency serves, and assets that the agency has, and a host of other issues. Money is also allocated to regional planning organizations that then sub-allocate it to agencies within their region. And so that's sort of the broad way in which transit money is allocated. It gets very complicated when metropolitan areas negotiate how they're going to spend their money, but so I can't speak to how the Bay Area does it in particular. But I know here in Washington there's like more than a dozen agencies in addition to the largest one, the Washington Metro, and so the money has to be allocated, and then they have to negotiate how they're going to spend that allocated money to all these agencies. And then Metro, the largest one, gets their own direct allocation of funding as well.
Right, and I think in the Bay Area something similar happens via our MTC.
Right.
Another question from Shahin. To your point, the policy problem is a big one, and it might go beyond transit versus highways. There's reporting that suggests fixing FRA regulations and conditions attached to federal funding would allow transit dollars to go further. Is there an opportunity to get legislative changes in procurement or capital construction regulations from Congress or the executive? It's a very targeted
question. The short answer is yes. It's not an area that my organization works on to a great deal, but I would be happy to talk more, learn more about what you're thinking, and maybe it's something we can take up, or maybe we can connect you with folks that are working in that space.
Sounds good. One more question from Adina at Seamless. Does Transportation for America have background on Alex Padilla's transportation record?
It's certainly something that we are going to look into. I'm sorry to say I haven't had a chance to do that yet. But I would be curious if you all have any insight as we look into it. We certainly want to learn more about him, about the 2 Georgia senators that are coming in, because it's three new senators can totally transform the Senate. So we want to learn what they're up to, what they're thinking.
Sounds good. We've got a whole host of questions and only a couple more minutes to get to them. Do you know the status of Congressman Seth Moulton's proposal for a national high-speed rail network?
Yeah, we've worked with him on that. And we work with Senator Markey on what he calls the brain train. Senator Wicker, the former chairman of the Commerce Committee, we work very closely with him. Senator Cantwell, the incoming chairwoman, very closely with her. So I can't speak specifically to the status of that bill. I think it has not yet been reintroduced in this Congress. But it was definitely a bill that got attention in the last Congress. And I think it played a big part in informing what the House passed, which had I didn't spend a lot of time talking about passenger rail, but one of the many, many things that we liked about the House bill was the passenger rail program. And even though it wasn't exactly what Mr. Moulton proposed, it was definitely informed by that. And so, I expect he'll reintroduce it. I expect that the House will move forward with the Invest Act again. And so they're working to kind of support each other.
Thanks.
But then on passenger rail, let me just say, in the Senate, they didn't get to passenger rail last year. They only passed their highways bill. But I mentioned Mr. Wicker and Senator Cantwell. They're the 2 leads on the committee that has jurisdiction over passenger rail. And we have every reason to think that both of them want to see really robust passenger rail program. And, we work closely with them. And so we're very hopeful that the Senate, I know we're apprehensive about the Senate on a lot of things, and I talked about that in the presentation, but on passenger rail, we have a lot of reasons to think that we'll see a pretty robust bill coming out of the new chairwoman, Senator Cantwell.
Great. And I think this will be the last question. Do you see federal funding for demonstration programs for innovative, sustainable programs being included in the next Surface Transportation Act to support local projects like innovative curb management or sustainable shared micromobility?
Oh, absolutely. And there were programs in the House bill that would have done that. And we have proposed that we need programs, broadly along what you just described. The Senate didn't do much of that in their bill, but we think that's one of the many things that we need to improve upon. So we'll look to the House because they did it, and we'll encourage the Senate to follow their lead. And short answer is yes. There's an opportunity, and we want to see it happen.
Great. All right, and with that, we're at time. So thank you, Scott, for joining us. That was a fantastic presentation. Thanks for everyone else for tuning in and for all of your great questions. If you want to reach out to us, you can at hello@streetsforpeople.city. And with that, Scott, do you have any last words?
No, just feel free to send me any questions that you may have, and I'm happy to either answer them or point you to someone who can better answer them. And thank you so much for the opportunity and for your advocacy. It really is making a huge difference, and we really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good evening.